everybody. Please join me in welcoming Venkat Kuppuswamy, our guest for today. I'll introduce him briefly. Venkat is a rising star in the strategy field. He is currently assistant professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the DeMoore McKim School of Business at Northeastern University. Did I pronounce that even close to correctly? I'm not sure.
You did very well.
Okay.
I must say, yeah.
Okay. He also had previously served on the faculty at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He earned his DBA degree at Harvard Business School, where he studied under Carlos Baldwin and wrote his dissertation called The Performance Consequences of Firm Scope Choices. He basically has two streams of research. In the first stream, he studies the biases and forms of discrimination confronting minority entrepreneurs, particularly on crowd-based platforms like crowdfunding. And his second stream of research is where he studies the performance consequences of corporate diversification decisions. He was nominated for the Best Business Professor of the Year award by The Economist magazine. And as I said, he's a rising star in the field. So please join me in welcoming Venkat.
Thanks, everyone. So kind.
Good. So I usually start these interviews by asking people about, how they got started in this field, how they came to be a strategy professor, because I've never known a 10-year-old who has said, "Mommy, I want to be a strategy professor when I grow up." So
well, hopefully some of our kids do that, but
maybe.
I don't think it's normal.
Yeah, I met up at the AOM conference with someone who was actually close to having said that as a kid. But obviously it's an indirect pathway to this career for many of us. Certainly.
For sure.
Yeah, as it was for me and for many others, and I guess it probably was for you.
Yeah, I mean,
you studied computer science and mathematics.
Yeah.
So tell me about how you got into this.
Yeah, I was pretty hardcore as a computer scientist in mathematics. I mean, I worked at IBM. I was in a co-op program at the University of Toronto, and I served all my terms at IBM as well. And so I would say I was pretty good at what I did, but I started realizing that I didn't love it. So I quickly disentangled being good at something with having a passion for it. And I was like, okay, I have this math background and this computer science background. What in theory could I do other than this? And my dad is an entrepreneur, and I come from, a bunch of people who love reading about the world and discussing it and debating it. And so my dad held an MBA, and I always thought, maybe might be something I'm interested in, business school. So I was checking out the websites of Harvard Business School and University of Toronto for MBA application information and just some requirements. Then I saw this tab that said doctoral, and I'm like, doctoral? What's that? I clicked on it, and I'm like, wait a minute. So, because on the previous tab, it said I had to pay $100,000 to get my MBA. And then on the other tab that said PhD, it said, wait, you could spend, we'll pay you. And you could study essentially whatever you want, and you can make your whole career out of this. And then, I mean, I'm a pretty database guy. So then I was like, okay, what is this career? So then I started looking at lifestyle data on professors, and I'm like,
you're like, what's the catch here?
Yeah, I mean, this is good. I mean, I get to have summers off in theory, and I have a boss, but everyone's kind of their own kind of independent agent. And this is great. Do people not know about this thing? So I asked my dad. He's like, well, someone taught us that in an MBA. So clearly there is a PhD, but I always thought you had to do a PhD in economics. When I'm, no, Dad, there's an actual PhD in business, like strategy and management. They're like, oh, well, do I have to pay anything? He said, and I said, no. He's like, go for it. And so I applied to a couple of master's programs as well. but I got into, a couple of schools. And when you're Indian and Harvard accepts you, you can't tell your parents you went to a different school. It would be a whole thing. So as soon as my parents learned that I got in, they were like, "Oh, all right, congratulations, you're going." I'm like, "Yeah, yeah." Well, I kind of decided, but thanks for your support. And so that's kind of what got me into the field. I just really love the idea of being able to just read, learn, and conduct some research. I was familiar with research from the kind of natural sciences. I had helped out on some in bio labs. I've done some work with some computer scientists in artificial intelligence. So I understood what research was, but the fact that you can actually be practical to businesses with, your PhD work and not get stuck in a lab was really interesting to me. And I just loved the whole prospect of it. I was talking to Dan Snow, who I think he was at Oxford. I think he's at BYU now. I'm not exactly sure where, but Dan, if you see this, hope you're doing well. Dan told me that our profession is one of the greatest market imperfections that no one has really corrected. And I heard that in my first year as a doctoral student. I've never forgotten it. And I truly believe it. So before this whole window gets closed, I'd love to kind of have a great long career.
Very good, very good. Yeah, I mean, we may get disrupted at some point, but
yeah,
I think we are very blessed to have such.
You know what? It beats going into the lab. I must say. When I say a lab, I mean a computer science lab with other people eating Cheetos in the corner. So that was my prior. When I'm comparing things to.
Right. It's a great job, and as Jeff Ryer has told doctoral students, the worst case scenario is still pretty good in this career.
It's a great life. I mean,
everything goes bad, and it doesn't work out. In terms of your research goes to crap. You still have good options. So
the backup is great, and the ceiling is high, and it's. I hope to some extent, the more people who view this, the more correction there will be in the market. But we're all very lucky.
Right. So, tell us a little bit about what you did at IBM. You said was IBM the only job that you held between?
Yeah. So before. Yeah, so I was a database performance analyst. I would handle these giant database products that IBM was still pursuing at the time. Basically, we were competing with Oracle, with DB2, and I was helping write that product and test it and debug it and deal with the innovation folks. But what really kind of also drew me towards our career is every day I'd enter the offices at IBM, I'd walk by this kind of university industry partnership lab with really nice glass, windows and people inside who looked important, all tinkering away at things. And I'd walk by that to the elevators up to my little cubicle and be like, what's going on over there? Why are they collaborating with the university folks?
Right.
I mean, what's that all about? Then I saw this wall of patents next to that, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then one day I kind of ran into someone. He's like, oh, it's really cool there. I'm still in I'm a postdoc, but I'm working with industry here because my research can be applied here. I'm like, oh, okay, so you can kind of have a foot in both camps. If you're kind of in academic research, this is kind of cool. Still, I don't really envy being a computer science postdoc, but I find the idea of IBM still having a toehold in universities fascinating. I mean, I didn't know that there's a giant academic literature and all this stuff at the time. I just thought personally it was kind of cool. And they had the best snacks. They had the best, they had the best foosball table. They had the best games and the LAN system where you could play all sorts of great things during break. I was like, these guys have it great. I'm writing code up there, and these guys are having all the fun. And little did I know that was just a little sample of what, our life could be. But now I guess the joke's kind of on me because Silicon Valley seems to have taken that concept and run with it. And now I think your life's basically made when you get to Google. Like they do your laundry, they serve you dinner and lunch and breakfast. So I don't know if I made the truly right decision, but I'm happy. So that's kind of what got me interested in that line of work. Really was IBM and the idea that research can have industrial applications and you could still be relevant to practice. That initial insight in IBM was a big thing. And I've worked with my dad on entrepreneurial projects. He's a metallurgist, and so we have some projects like the 3D printing of basically prosthetics and medical implants in India. So I still hold a significant toe in the entrepreneurship space there.
Oh, good. So you know whereof you speak. Being a
yeah, and entrepreneurship in India is really the Wild West. It's like funding's crazy. Proof of concept means something, but it's not the same as over here. No one trusts anyone the same way that they might over here. You have a patent, IP regimes are totally different over there too. Client expectations are different too. So I would say that my dad has kept me real my entire professional life. Whenever I research something or whenever I have an idea, he asks me what I'm working on. And usually if he's interested in it and he finds it interesting or rather relevant, then I see it as a really good sign. Otherwise, if he's like, okay, are you having fun? That's a red flag for me. So
it didn't pass the dad test.
It didn't pass the test. As long as it's a Bible thing to him and his, fellow entrepreneurs and, practical folk in places like India, that really matters to me. And so I think we are all served when we have some people who keep us in check.
Right, absolutely. So okay, so they helped you in Harvard Business School. Mom and Dad said you got to go. Tell us a little bit about your experience there in your DBA program.
Yeah, so I have the illustrious designation of being the last admit to what was once called the IT management PhD program. It was a joint program between business school and the School of Applied Sciences, and they shut it down the year after I joined. I was the last that
ruined it for everybody.
Yeah, I ruined it for everyone. Katie Milkman, David Bruner, Brad Statz. I think Brad might have not been there, but it was a good line of people. But then we found out that just working across research cultures was really tough. And so I said, can I pick which side I join? I already had experience the computer science side of things. And I said, no, I want to be a full-on DBA student. And so, so I went with the TOM program, the Technology and Operations Management Group at HBS. And for those of you who are familiar with that group, it's a really eclectic group of folk some of who do really hardcore operations research, some of whom do really interesting innovation work. Lee Fleming was one of my early mentors over there. And when I had joined, you had people like Kareem Lakhani join a year later as faculty. And so it was a really interesting time to be in the TOM group. You had a lot of just really varied interests. And that was actually one of, that became a theme of mine. I got partnered with Carlos Baldwin right off the bat. I was really lucky to do so. I remember my PhD interview with her. We ended up talking about chocolate chip cookies, I think, for the first 10 minutes. And then next thing you know, my interview was over. And I thought, oh my God, did I just spend my interview talking to Carlos Baldwin about chocolate chip cookies? I am definitely not seeing the inside of that room ever again. But little did I know that, it worked out, and she became my initial advisor. And she gave me a book on the, by, I believe it was on Notes on the Synthesis of Design, and a Herbert Simon book as well on my first day, and said, read this. And I never looked back. She was a great mentor, but I think her challenge with me and this is kind of a theme as you might see going forward, is I like a lot of things. I'm interested in a lot of different topics, and I really see that as a perk of our profession. I know I advise doctoral students to be narrow as much as possible, but I definitely don't walk that talk. I like what I like. I find things interesting, and as long as it has a practical component and can help an actual business person, I am usually pro project. But I've learned over time to kind of at least have a loose, boundary to my topic interest. But Carlos's biggest challenges with me were I found a lot of things interesting, and she really tried to teach me how to ask a good research question. And to her credit, she never stifled my interest. She never said, "Hey, I'm Carlos Baldwin. I study modularity and firm boundaries, and you need to do something in that realm." No, she really let me talk to everyone. I was interested in things as distant as psychological biases following trigger shyness following failure, and how that might affect entrepreneurs to repeat an idea. Well, that ended up becoming a project I'm working on now, but like at the time, it was a very social psych idea. And I was just very blessed with advisors who let me kind of, I wouldn't say founder is the but really test these ideas and fail and realize that, oh, that's not going to work out. So I felt like my first year at HBS I was like a traveling salesman, where I would knock on people's doors and say, "Hey, I have this idea," and I'd pitch it to them, and they shut the door in a very loving way, but they still shut the door. And then it really trained me to think about how to pitch. So I learned that every time I would walk into Carlos Baldwin's office with an idea, I'd usually come up with a PowerPoint slide or two, because I learned that I wasn't the best extemporaneous pitcher of ideas. That if I had stuff written down or with PowerPoint slides to kind of guide my pitch, it would go better. And so these are small little things that I kind of learned over time, that how to convince others that this was a good idea. And then I must have gone, into a number of different areas when I finally figured, I really like this vertical integration, this product scope thing, and oh, hey, that's kind of what Carlos does. She's actually the perfect advisor for this. So I guess I came home after jaunting about quite a bit into different subject realms. But and Carlos's son at the time was a screenwriter. I came from Toronto. We have a very strong film industry there, and I have a bunch of friends involved in film production. So movies has always been something I, deeply love. In fact, I've been criticized by my significant others in life that I watch too much television and, go to too many movies. But I kind of convinced Carlos that I could study vertical integration in the movie industry and that it was a good idea. And so I had a giant excuse to watch movies and collect data on movies for a long time. And so that's kind of how I got interested in, that's how I found my empirical context. So my idea eventually was, hey, we know a lot about make-buy decisions. We know a lot about why firms vertical integrate, but we don't really know about whether those decisions work out too much. Like the empirical literature was still a step behind the theory. And so I thought I would help. And Rich, you know this literature really well. I mean, I remember presenting one of my early works at ACAC. I think that's the first time I met you there. And I found it to be a really nice space, the whole vertical integration, horizontal scope space, where as an empirically inclined researcher, I can make a dent if possible. But as I'll discuss in a bit. I mean, it was quite hard to make a dent in a literature that is as old as the boundaries of the firm. And so I soon discovered that sometimes you can take a risk on an emerging domain and to make a name for yourself. And I kind of did that. So I was really interested in firm scope. Throughout my doctoral, after I would say my second year, I really started to narrow down. And I was really thankful for the guidance that Carlos and others gave. But Carlos, Belen Villalonga, Ranjay Gulati, these were like my primary advisors, along with Christina McKellerin, who joined my committee towards the end.
Right. So let me rewind you a little bit, because there was a piece of that story that I think might be helpful for our doctoral students.
Yeah.
Your traveling salesman phase. So
wow, that was rough.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that may be where some doctoral students kind of get stuck, or maybe even, don't even know how to approach that phase of their of their doctoral studies. I remember Bob Gibbons said, "We have no idea what happens in the third year of a doctoral program, but it is absolutely essential, and it takes 1 year." So
I totally concur with that.
So what was it that you were? So when they closed the doors and said, "No, I'm sorry, that's not a good idea," what was typically the thing that your ideas were missing? What was wrong with the ideas that you were bringing?
I think
that got the doors closed.
So part of the reason the doors closed a little faster than it might at another institution was that Harvard had a tradition of RAs, like a strong tradition of RAs. So a professor didn't necessarily need to work with you. They had research support elsewhere, outside the doctoral pool. And so if they have a very strong line of research and work going, you didn't really get they didn't need to help you. Like now that I'm on the professor side, I kind of see that. But I learned that a lot of my ideas sounded good in theory, but the practical elements of research, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to get that data from? How are you going to measure that? You're talking about this construct, but have you read every definition of how to define it? You're talking about, studying this in, industry X. Have you explored data in industry X? Do you want to be, just the tangible elements of empirical research that I am very cognizant of now? I wasn't aware of the hardship of putting together a data set, testing it, measuring it, designing a estimation approach. Like I was an idea guy. I came up with an idea. I thought this is cool. I think there's a gap in the literature here. Let's do it. But I guess I implicitly assumed that I get some help along the way in how to do it. And eventually that did happen, but it only happened when I started to propose, hey, we could test it in this context with this. I know about this data set. I know about, this other researcher who used this technique. We can build upon their work. So I would say I got smarter in the challenges of research. And it was really, really hard not to take no personally. And sometimes when a professor says no, they don't actually say no, but because they were far too nice to say no. But I kind of, unless the professor was jumping up and down in a meeting, I considered it a personal failure that I didn't do my part to pitch my idea well. And I just think that comes with time. It came with working on research projects with professors. Like Lee Fleming had me work on a whole bunch of network-related projects that didn't really materialize into anything, but really taught me the tools of the trade. So I give Lee Fleming a lot of credit for that. Like, because Carlos is primarily a theorist and a formal modeler, so she actively encouraged me to work with other empirical researchers in the program, in the faculty. So Belen was in the finance department, but really known in the management circles for her work in diversification. Ranjay joined midway through my program from Northwestern. He joined HBS, and it was really good to talk to other empirical researchers. And we had this internal doctoral seminar series where doctoral students would kind of pitch ideas to, I think, Mike Toffel at the time. And Mike Toffel comes from the BPP program of Berkeley, and that's we used to call them the indigeneity mafia. I mean, like they know identification, and so I think my skin thickened over time. I was cognizant of the challenges of empirical research, and I got smarter. I think in how to pitch and be cognizant of the initial red flags and address them, and eventually some of those doors remained open.
Mm-hmm. So once you could begin to show some level of plausibility to the project, that you had gotten partway towards solving the execution problems, people came alongside to help you out with that.
Right, and in hindsight, it was just a matter of people are busy. You know, they have their own projects, they have their own really busy. Like I was a single guy, young, had no kids. I still don't have any kids, but you know, I had no real awesome life other than my research. Faculty usually have full families and work-life balance is a thing, and unless you can find a way to plug in to their stream, you know, it might, for no fault of your own and no fault of their own, you know, it just might not be a good match. And so I guess in hindsight, all this is so clear to me, but back then, I lived ideas, and once I married ideas with practicality and the nuances of empirical, you know, data set construction and research design, things worked better.
Mm-hmm. So there's another interesting piece to this journey, which is, so you came into the program with, it sounded like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounded like with a strong focus on the phenomena, that you were, you knew a lot from your days at IBM. You knew a lot about, at least something about the film scene in Toronto, and you knew a fair amount from your family about entrepreneurship in India.
Yeah.
And so you had a lot of kind of, at least in those three areas, some knowledge of the phenomena side.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, when you come into a doctoral program, it's not all about phenomena, it's also about theory. Tell us a little bit about how you made that transition to taking a more, you know, to adopting a more theoretical view.
I think all the credit goes to Carlos. I mean, Carlos is a theorist. She is a formal modeler. And I think HBS historically has been such a phenomenon-driven place. It almost prided itself on that for decades. That it, honestly, it remains hard to this day. I am so drawn to phenomena, but I think reading the literature, debating with Carlos, when I say debating, I mean me making a point, but then her correcting me most of the time. I learned that I had to think about theory to convince people to join on, because I would usually come to them with a phenomenon that was interesting. And then they would say, okay, so what's the research question? I'm like, research question? But this thing's happening. We should investigate it. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, but how are we going to tie this into a research question into a literature? I'm like, okay. And you know, when you hear something like 10, 20, 40 times, you're like, okay, I got to really think about these literature gaps. And I hated doing lit reviews. Like my personal hell is doing a lit review, is someone asking me to do an entire lit review on a field that I am little familiar with. I have done that so often, but now I ask others to do that as well. It's really important to know whether this phenomena is related to a theoretical gap that you can actually answer, and not just answer. Is it still important if you answer? So one thing that Carlos really instilled in me is reading the literature, doing a lit review, identifying the gaps in the work, and if I'm still hooked onto the phenomena and can link it to the gap, then we might have something here. So it was just a lot of trial and error and a lot of gritting my teeth and learning that it's really like the number of projects that have failed when I thought only about phenomenon versus thinking about the theoretical gap and trying to find a place where I could do it is it's completely skewed towards the theory first approach.
Mm-hmm.
Now, usually at this stage, I'm piqued by a phenomena, then I quickly think about, okay, this looks like this is linked to this theory A or this theoretical body B. I think no one's really looked at this issue within that literature. So I quickly marry a phenomena, I guess something that piques my interest in the phenomenon with the theory quickly. But without theory, I've had too many lumps on my head that I'd be an idiot if I didn't learn by now. It's theory, and especially when you're working with co-authors who have been trained in schools that are way more traditional theory-driven places. Their first question is, okay, so what's the theoretical direction we're taking? And so I learned that because when you're a doctoral student, you're usually working on your own or with a faculty member, but when you kind of move into the faculty ranks and you have to work with other, you get to work with other friends and colleagues, they are trained very differently from you and they think differently from you, which is great. But it means that you have to plug into their, cognitive frameworks. And that usually meant more theory. But a small tip to doctoral students, find your weak spot and co-author with someone who's really good in that weak spot. And this is usually more helpful after you're a doctoral student when you have more choice in the matter. But like I consider myself pretty strong in the data and methods part of our world. I am good at theory. I'm not great at theory. So I love working with really smart people like Carlos Baldwin, Peter Yuncken, great like sociologists and people who can push my theoretical thinking, and test it. Like in this paper I'm going to be presenting later today, Ruth Aguilera is really strong on theory. And so when I came to her with this idea, I had a theoretical pitch, but pitching it to someone who's even stronger in theory sharpens it. So I feel like my theoretical blade, I discovered I needed a theoretical blade quickly during my doctoral time, and I continue to sharpen it to this day. I consider it something I can still improve, and I will always do so. But I've gotten smarter at partnering with people who are great at it.
Right. I find that this is one of the most difficult skills for doctoral students and junior faculty to learn is how to do research in a way that joins an existing conversation. Because if you're doing research that's disconnected from the existing conversations that are in the literature, nobody's going to be interested in publishing it because nobody's going to see how it's relevant to what the field is doing.
Yeah.
And so,
absolutely.
Framing is the big challenge for doctoral students.
Absolutely. I was also very sensitive. I would say I was like, as soon as I saw a paper that was at all closely related to an idea I had, I'm like, oh, I've been scooped. They took my idea. I am useless. But I then really learned that we're all trying to have conversations that build upon each other. And if someone's done some related work, it's not the end of the world. Number of times I thought I had to start from square one because someone had done something in the patent space related to biotech. There's a lot of papers that build upon each other. And so especially when I was working on my thesis, when someone was doing anything related to firm scope and movies, I was, oh no, I'm done. They have taken, I'm never going to publish this. I have been replaced. But then I soon learned that that's foolish. A lot of people use similar contexts, and as long as you have a distinct theoretical, contribution, that's what matters. We all recycle research contexts. It's the question, it's the theory, it's the literature pushing nature of your project. That's what matters, and it's so hard to see that when you're a junior doctoral student, but because you really, really are so sensitive at that point that anything even close to your research domain, you're first scared, but then you're like, oh, I need to build a relationship with these scholars in this space. And so you have to, at least I needed to flip the switch from thinking of people as rivals to, hey, this is my community. I want to see these people.
Right.
I look forward to seeing these people at conferences and at seminars. And I can't wait until we grab a hot dog or a pizza slice after the session and talk more about your work, because I'm learning something. The number of times I've sat in a seminar of someone's work that I thought was quite related to mine, and I came away with some new idea, it's quite common. And some of those people became co-authors. I mean, literally, those people became co-authors. And I love my community. I love work. That's like the best part of our profession. You get to work with your friends and do something cool together, hopefully. And so just switching the mindset from everyone stealing my space to, hey, we're all in this together. These topics are big and tough, and you're going to require 8, 10, 20 papers to really tease out the nuances. That's cool. I mean, Rich, the number of papers in some of those ACAC, sessions that, build upon each other. I mean, that's kind of what taught me that we are all kind of, all contributing one tiny brick to a hopefully big wall.
Right. Yeah, and I definitely relate to what you're saying, because I definitely had one of those, oh no, I'm done moments. And it was when I read the McDonald and Ryle 2004 management science paper, and I'm like, these guys are so much better at doing this than I am. They're so far beyond my skill level. I can never compete with this. But what I've discovered is that I don't have to compete with it, because I can take a different angle and use the tool to answer different questions and for different problems than they are, and so and can still do pretty well. So yeah, I agree. So let me take you back to where you were before I had you rewind, which was you discovered that you really liked this firm boundary issue.
Yeah.
And that you were excited about studying it in the film industry. And so that's a topic area. But again, as you were saying, it's not a specific research question. So how did you take that topic and narrow it down to a research question?
Well, I started to notice that Toronto became really famous for independent films. A lot of independent films were being produced there, and understanding the nuances of the industry, there were studio financed films versus indie films. And for those of you who don't know, indie films are usually financed independently and then distributed by a major distributor. So a major distributor can distribute their own projects. They could also distribute those produced by someone else. I mean, this is a little bit more topical given the Netflix situation and all that stuff going on right now. But it was timely then too. And then at the same time, I was reading vertical integration related work. And then I was like, oh, that's actually a form of vertical integration. What I'm seeing is vertical integration. But it seems like the movie industry is particularly novel because you have so many products produced per year, and you have objective outcome information for each product. Now, there's a lot of literature, and the LaFontaine and Slade article, the review, a lot of these articles on TCE and elsewhere usually point to the fact that we still don't know too much about the performance outcomes. We know what the drivers of vertical integration are, but we still don't know whether those are optimal in hindsight. That I started to notice that's a gap in the theory, and that there's a bunch of people looking to contribute to that gap. But I thought, hey, this setting is actually perfect to explore this, because you have alliances, you have issues of equity stakes, all various levels of vertical integration, and you have asset-specific investments like marketing investments, and you have all this great stuff that is consistent with the theory that you can test. And then, so I pitched it to Harless, very nervous. I pitched it, and she's like, "Yeah, why don't you go take a look at that? That seems like a good idea." And I was like, I was so happy walking out of that office that day. It turned out
once I got an idea accepted.
For once. So that's how that idea materialized into a project that became a job market paper. And what I learned at the time was the paper tested the performance outcomes of vertical integration, but it also proposed a new reason to vertical integrate, centered around the uncertainty of distribution. And I learned it's really hard proposing a new rationale for vertical integration.
You bet.
And it was just maybe bad luck, because the same year I was proposing a new reason to vertical integrate, Oliver Williamson won the Nobel Prize for his work. And I'm like, every time I sent that paper out to a journal, they'd be like, we love the performance part, but we hate this other part. And it was just really hard to publish that work. But I ended up publishing another movie paper later. But so that all that stuff that went into that paper ended up being useful for a different project. But what I would say is I also, really became good at trying to see gaps in empirical work. So I was sitting, when I was at Harvard, for those of us who didn't have an MBA, they gave us the option of taking the first year of the MBA program. And I did so because I wanted to see what that's like. And I remember sitting in a classroom during lunch when someone runs in saying that Bear Stearns just fell, or Morgan Stanley just defaulted or something like that. Right. And I was like, wait, is that, because
I think it might have been Lehman Brothers?
Yeah, Lehman. Yeah, there you go, Lehman. And then I was a computer scientist. I did not know much about finance, and I was in a totally different tech world. And so I turned to my friends, is that a big deal? It sounds like a big deal. And people are like, oh my God, Lehman has fallen. And I'm like, oh, that's not good. But then maybe within 24 hours, I was talking to Belen Villalonga about corporate diversification and the diversification discount. I'm like, I shot her an email like, Belen, don't you think this would be the perfect time to test whether diversified firms increase in value during a credit crisis where no one has access to capital? And she wrote back within 3 minutes and said, that's actually a really good idea. And that was a case where something happened in the world. I thought about the theory, and then I'm like, well, this seems like a perfect empirical context to test this. And so the next 3 months, we put together a working paper, and that was eventually published. But I got better at turning phenomenological, I guess, pokes in my brain into actual theoretical possibilities. And it, that's why whenever I talk to doctors, I tell them, read a newspaper. Like, actually, don't just scan like the funny stuff, like read. Like, a lot of my research ideas come from just reading the world and like seeing developments in the Financial Times, in the Wall Street Journal. More often than not, there's something there. So I turned my initial interest in movies into an actual tangible theoretical idea related to vertical integration. And same thing with the credit crisis paper that came from a student running into my lunch hall screaming, Lehman has fallen. And I thought, hey, you know what? If no one has access to money, maybe this is when diversified firms will increase in value. And no one had really tested that. And shocking to me, because every time I come up with an idea, I'm like, oh, someone's probably done that. And like this other paper that got published this year, looking at the role of diversity in Hollywood. I was working on a different diversity paper related to crowdfunding, and I saw a Twitter hashtag go across my screen that Oscar's so white. The Oscar nominations had come out, and no actor or actress of race had been of minority ethnicity status had been nominated. And then so there was a huge controversy that, the Oscars are too white. And I sat there and I thought, well, that's actually an assumption. And that's a research question. 1 year is not a fact. Do we see this over time? Surely someone has looked into this, and some sociologist or someone familiar with this. Then I kind of went to my co-author and I'm like, hey, Pete, this whole controversy, that's a research question. And I did a lit review, and no one has looked at the role of diversity in whether customers are to blame for diversity choices, and tested it using the movie industry. Like, because usually you don't have outcome data. I think if there's a theme in my work is that I find questions that lack performance data, and I find a context tested with performance data, and I test those assumptions in the theory. And usually, in the case of the movie industry, we found that minority-based products ended up doing better than the conventional wisdom. And I guess another skill set I have is to find interesting data. So for those of you who don't know, Sony Pictures got hacked by the North Koreans at some point. Right. Yeah, and then I went and found that data, and I was able to get some interesting performance data that usually don't get on foreign box office. So I was able to show that actors of minority race, the notion that they don't sell overseas is unfounded, because I actually I used some of that public now data for an additional analysis. And I think that has become my strong suit, finding data that can be used to answer these lingering theoretical questions and hopefully provide a timely answer to a practical problem.
Okay, so niches where there's performance data that isn't usually available elsewhere that enables you to answer questions that otherwise wouldn't be answerable.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have strong suits. My computer science and programming background has served me well in being able to pull in really hard to code data, and I try to leverage it. And as we've learned from the resource-based view and the capabilities literature, know where your strong suits are.
Right. So what have been the biggest challenge? Well, maybe I start with the dissertation project. Once you had the dissertation topic, what were the biggest challenges in terms of executing?
I would say, from an execution standpoint, the credit crisis diversification chapter was really scary, because I felt I was in a horse race with every other finance scholar. I was a management scholar, but I felt like this was such a finance idea that someone somewhere also had this idea. We're all like you know how now there's like a billion COVID papers? That's how I felt.
Right.
I felt like I had this credit crisis idea, and I need to get this out in 3 months. But my only saving grace was I felt that no one has more time to dedicate to research than an ambitious doctoral student. And no one's going to beat me, because I'm going to work on this every second of the day I can. Right. I'm going to put on something on Netflix, and no one's going to beat me as I code and analyze this data. So that was a really stressful time for me, because I felt that, if I'm beat, I'm beat. Like there's no, that idea was very narrow, that if someone actually scooped it, game over for that paper. So that was a really stressful thing. For my other main
But you did have the benefit of coming up with the idea on the same day that the event occurred, right? So you had maybe a head start over other people who might have taken a couple of days to figure it out.
Yes, and so I set up the entire empirical machinery waiting for CompuStat to drop that update for the next quarter's results. So I had set everything up. We'd written the intro. It was all set up, just waiting for the.
Oh, you even started writing the paper.
Oh yeah.
Before the data dropped. Wow.
Absolutely. In theory, that was the most perfect research idea, because we had a hypothesis. We had written it. We were literally waiting for the data to become available to actually run the model. So it was the most pure hypothesis-driven investigation, and
you had the asterisks in the table already. You just needed to type the numbers in, right?
Literally, unfortunately, I added a few more asterisks, which was a nice surprise. But the movie paper struggled because, honestly, vertical integration is such an old literature that it was really hard framing the theoretical contribution in a very succinct way that made your paper stand out and not just a test of someone else's theory. Like, it's one thing to test the theory, but I also wanted to advance it. And so having this dialogue with some a really big body of literature and getting your hands around it was very humbling. And so soon after I, landed a job at UNC, Barry Bayes, who was a marketing professor at UNC, was giving a talk in Karim Lapani's Open Innovation Seminar Series, and he was presenting some work on crowdsourcing with the Dell platform. And as someone who studied firm boundaries and vertical integration, open innovation was kind of like the sexy next thing that, oh, you know what, I can't do it right now during my thesis, but I really want to do something in that realm. And so Carlos is like, oh, you just signed your contract 2 days ago. Why don't you go say hi to this Barry Bayes? He's your new colleague. And I said, oh, okay, sure. I'll check it out. And then we got to talking after the seminar. And I thought it was so cool that he was like this big, distinguished marketing professor who came to my tiny doctoral cubicle, and he sought me out. And I thought that was a really nice gesture. Like, I mean, he's so nice. He's a great guy. And we started talking about crowdfunding. And I thought this was fascinating because, I mean, I had come from a line of entrepreneurs, and okay, there's a new way to get capital. Like, how does this work? Where are the boundary implications? Like, wait, what's happening here? And then I kind of made a bet during my first year at UNC. And I think it's a really big gamble, and I wouldn't say other people should necessarily do it. But I was really having trouble trying to publish my job market paper. And I realized that, rather than be researcher 10 million in vertical integration, I can be one of the first 5 people researching crowdfunding and applying a kind of firm boundaries perspective to it, or trying to understand this phenomena, but trying to apply the firm boundaries literature to it. And I think I'll bet on that. I know this might not work out, but I'll do that. And, worst case scenario, I can always go back to vertical integration. But it worked out for me. But what was difficult was sometimes the phenomenon is so new that the reviewers don't even understand it. Mm-hmm. So they kept asking, how is this different from venture capital? How is this different from venture capital? And so I spent the first 2 years banging my head trying to publish crowdfunding work. And then I guess when it rains, it pours eventually. Eventually, I think the field caught up to my interest in the phenomenon. And honestly, I got better at finding a theoretical home for it. So it kind of goes back to, I keep relearning that it's the theory that guides it. So once I realized that the theory guides everything with crowdfunding, I got much better at finding a home for it. But to that point, I'll just say one thing. As an empirical researcher, I found that I had the greatest success only after conducting qualitative interviews. I think it is incredibly important for doctoral students who are empirically inclined to not end at their data set collection efforts. If you are researching crowdfunding, talk to every entrepreneur crowdfunding within a 50-mile radius of Purdue campus. So that's what I did. I interviewed every crowdfunder in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina. I talked to every one of them. And I asked them how it's going, what are the stories I got were incredible. But those interviews led me to a research insight that I would have never gotten otherwise. Because every time I talked to a minority entrepreneur about crowdfunding, they were like, that stuff doesn't work for me. I heard it once, I heard it twice. I heard it so often that I was like, wait a minute, are there some biases, racial biases on these platforms? Because the whole promise of crowdfunding was that, hey, you know what?
Right? Yeah.
It's a democratic, anonymous, race neutral, gender neutral platform. And I kept hearing that minority entrepreneurs might not love it. And then, so once I actually collected the data, I spent a lot of time coding race just because I was curious about what I had heard in the interviews. And it was really significant. And I'm like, oh boy, there's a whole project here. And then I realized I'm not a race or gender scholar. Yeah. I'm a firm boundaries guy. So you know what I did? I told myself to do a whole lit review on. So I'm like, okay, first of all, you need to partner with someone who knows this literature a little bit better than you do, and you need to treat yourself like a doctoral student. If you really want to study race and gender, these are some of the oldest constructs in our research domain at AOM. So don't even pretend that you're an expert on this. Read everything. So I did. Well, not everything. I read a lot, and then I really found that if I can marry the firm boundaries crowdsourcing literature with some of the entrepreneurship work on race and gender, that there is a nexus here that I could really be a part of. And so some people might wonder, how did I end up in race gender work when I did my PhD in firm boundaries? Well, it was that one project.
Yeah.
It was that one insight that led me to look at race and gender in crowdfunding. And then I guess, like I said, when it rains, it pours. And I'm like, oh, wait, this actually succeeded in getting published. I find this stuff fascinating. So let me see if I can look at gender in crowdfunding too. And I ended up doing that. And next thing you know, I have 2, 3, 4 papers in race gender related domains. And I guess some people might even consider me a race gender bias scholar now. But it came almost accidentally based on some qualitative interviews. And I just really, Rich, if you remember, one of my core principles was your work needs to be important and matter to real people. So when I started sharing these findings in North Carolina, I got called to the State House to present, because they were passing legislation on crowdfunding. And so I actually spoke to, farmers on how to set up crowdfunding sites for their machinery and renovating their barns. And, so I felt like my work actually mattered, and that was critical to me. So I felt, okay, this is a landscape. I'm getting some publication success finally. It seems to matter, and my dad cares. So it seems to pass the dad test. And my mom was just happy for me, but my dad really, he cared about the relevance of it. I did to research domain after taking a really big gamble. And so when people ask me what one of my research domains is, hey, I study racial and gender biases in market for talent and capital. So now it's become I would say a pretty big part of my research identity.
Right. So your research really kind of spans 3 literatures. You've got the firm boundaries, the crowdfunding, and the race and gender bias. So let me ask you one question that maybe cuts across all 3 of those. What do you think is the most important unanswered question in each of those literatures? What do we not know about each of those topics that we really ought to know by this point?
So when it comes to the intersection of entrepreneurship and race and gender, I would say we're really good at documenting biases, but we don't have a great number of solutions. So one thing that I'm very cognizant of in my work is I will try to always publish a race and gender paper only if it has a solution for the bias that I document. When I was in North Carolina and you go to a minority entrepreneur and you tell them, hey, there's bias against you, they're gonna be like, no, of course there's bias against me. Like, so, well, can you help me? So unless you have an answer to the second part of the question, you're kind of useless. You're great maybe from a theoretical standpoint, but from a practical standpoint, what are you bringing to this farmer who's trying to get a new tractor or build a new really interesting solar panel on their roof? So I think the solutions angle of things is really important. We're getting better about it. I think in the vertical integration realm, I think we are understanding that firm boundaries has implications for social and I guess inequity more generally. I think vertical integration scholars are kind of expanding the range of performance outcomes they care about to include things like the pay gap. Is the pay gap greater in vertically integrated firms than not? Is corporate diversification a good thing for gender bias in the boardroom. Like, I think we're expanding the outcomes we care about from just ROA and financial metrics to a much broader set there. I think a lot of us are caring about sustainability and related constructs, and I think we're getting good there.
Okay. Let me try and squeeze in one last question. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule here. So I was looking at your Vita, and I could not see anything about work that you've done with doctoral students. Have you worked with any doctoral students yet?
I've had a chance at UNC to work with a few doctoral students, but at Northeastern we don't actually have a doctoral program, okay. So that kind of that's not a possible there. But I've really enjoyed working with doctoral students at UNC who have essentially become faculty now. Kevin Maselli, he's at Michigan
right.
State. Every time at AOM we kind of talk about some research ideas. And I would say that when I was a scholar trying in a completely new research domain of crowdfunding, that I don't think a lot of students, I mean, I might have been seen as a too risky a person to work with back then. I think many students were kind of wild with Atul Nerkar or Chris Bingham, but I think now I know people come up to me all the time, and I've kind of expanded the context to explore gender and racial biases in. Like the paper I'm presenting today is actually a gender paper on boards in India, but I still really consider myself one of the primary crowdfunding researchers out there, and so I love mentoring work in that realm, and I consider it a responsibility. I think crowdfunding is going to be around for a long time, and we still don't know a lot about it. It's still so new. So, right. Like at AOM, every time someone comes up to me with some research idea on crowdfunding, and I really like helping. It's actually gratifying to me to see that this thing that started when a handful of us started looking at it has now grown into a pretty strong research domain for a lot of people. And my one bit of advice that I always tell people is it should never be a crowdfunding study. It should be a study on construct X and Y that happens to be tested using crowdfunding data. So for various useful research purposes. And so I think that light bulb has really helped things for me.
Right. So what I was going to ask about this. So when you were mentoring Kevin and the other doctoral students at UNC, what was the most important piece of advice that you gave them? Don't give up.
I saw a lot of heavy hearts. In a lot of doctoral students, they come to, they're a little frustrated. They're a little concerned. They want to talk about this idea. The mechanics of some empirical approach. And, I said that, hey, I really try and be optimistic. And usually in an idea, there is some nugget that is really good. And I really try and target that nugget and say, you know what, that's really cool. I really focus on X because you don't know enough about it. So doctoral students have a predisposition to be a little bit bad when it comes to pitching ideas and pushing them forward because they're really hard and you don't have the experience to know that this is just part of the journey. And so I always try to help them think through empirical issues. I always tell them to think theory first. Like I really try to tell them to always think about the theoretical domain and I always recommend work that, hey, I can kind of relate to this other literature here. Have you read this paper by XYZ or this SMJ that came out? Because sometimes they might not be aware of it. So I just try to be a good shepherd as much as possible in terms of being optimistic, recognize the nugget, and direct them towards theoretical pastures that they might not be aware of. And if they happen to have an interest in my work, I am more than happy to walk them through the do's and don'ts that I've learned along the way there too.
That's great. Well, I think with that, we're out of time. So I just want to say thank you again, Venkat, for, for participating in our celebrity talk show. We really appreciate it. I know the doctoral
Thanks,
students
Rich.
get a lot out of it. So please join me in thanking Venkat.
Thanks, everyone.